So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Rohit Chakravarti is a bat researcher with experience in working in different landscapes in India. So this is really exciting. I've always wanted to go to India, and I'm just delighted to hear more about this talk. So Rohit has predominantly worked in the Himalayas, but also Andaman Islands. And Rohit currently works for Nature Conservation Foundation and Bat Conservation International, where he leads on conservation projects in India. And these include understanding the effects of urbanisation and wind energy on bats, which is obviously, as we all know, hugely important to understand our impact. Also exploring conflict between bats and archaeological site managers, and improving the knowledge of ecology of rare and endangered species. Additionally, there's going to be a conservation plan for Indian bats under development, the first since 2002. So an incredible amount of work going into that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rohit. Thank you, Rohit.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Rachel. And it's great to be on this platform, such a popular webinar series. And I'm sure it's one of those, it's like the TEDx of the bat world. So, if you haven't presented here, or presenting here is a matter of prestige for every bat researcher now. And I'm glad to have found that invitation in the 45th webinar. So, great to see all of you. Thank you for joining from so many different parts of the world. Um, and um, and I'm very excited to talk to you about bats in the Himalayas, which is predominantly where I've worked, but also a bit beyond, but not, unfortunately, no spoilers, but not in very far detail. But let me just run you through this, and I hope you have a good time. So, so for people who are not very familiar with Indian biodiversity, India is a really diverse, country, and I really hope that Rachel gets a chance to visit India sometimes, and so do most of you. And this diversity comes from, this vast amount of, vastly different eco regions that we have in India. We have deserts, we have cold deserts, we have the coast, we have rainforests, so everything thrives in this one big landmass. And of course, there are mountains. There are, not 40 plus, it should have been 440 plus. I don't know how I missed 1 4 there. But, we have 440 plus species of mammals, out of which 136 are bats. So more than 30% of our diversity is bats, and bats make up the largest order of mammals in India. So naturally, this diversity leads a field ecologist like myself to a doubt that where should I go and study bats in this whole wide country. And most of my decisions actually tend to be linked to my own geography. So I'm taking you back to the time when I was planning my master's dissertation. This happened in 2013, 14. Until then, I grew up in 3 different parts of the country. I was born in the in central India. I moved to Mumbai for my bachelor's, then I moved to Bangalore for my in the south for my master's, which is where I live and I'm joining from right now. In all of these places, I've had different bat experiences. I got interested in bats in Nagpur. I nurtured that interest in Bombay and in Bangalore. Beyond these, for field projects or for internships, assisting others, not for bat projects, but for other projects, I've been to some other parts of the country, including the Andaman Islands. And when the time came to choose my field site for the master's project, I was completely lost. And somebody gave me a very wise advice. That person said, think of the most beautiful place that you've been to, and the question will automatically come. So, out of all these places, the Andaman Islands was a no-brainer. And that's how I landed up in the islands. And I got even more greedy. I wanted to study bats all across the island. What would help me do that? A question like studying gene flow in bats and across the island, because then you have to go and sample each and every population. Now that it's done and dusted, I can tell my exact motivation and not hide it behind scientific motivations. So fieldwork in the Andaman Islands was great, going through mangroves, sampling bats that I had never seen before. And of course, this was my first project on bats, so you can see some very examples of poor bat handling, which I've learned from. But these were species that I'd never seen before, and it was great to have them in my hand. For example, the Andaman horseshoe bat, an endangered species endemic to the Andaman Islands. And not only did I see bats, but I also saw bats being eaten by snakes. And this particular snake doesn't seem to be very common. And all my herpetologist friends were sort of jealous of me because I saw them very often in caves hunting bats, but they didn't get to see the snake quite often. But after all of that, it was great. I got my master's dissertation done. I wanted to go back to the islands, but things didn't go as planned. So I consoled myself saying that, that this particular life, the beach life, is probably not meant for a 22-year-old. And while I still can, I should maybe try something more challenging. And that led me to Uttarakhand, which is in the western part of the Himalayas. So the Himalayas run all the way from this part of Kashmir all the way through to eastern India, going through India, Nepal, Bhutan, well, a bit of Pakistan, and of course some parts of China. And this part of the country is very fascinating. The last batch surveys here were done in the 1870s, so during the time of the British colonization. From those surveys, we know that 40 species of bats were reported from here, and an endemic species called the Peter's tube-nosed bat, which is so far only been seen twice, was also discovered here. And a spoiler, I didn't see it, so I haven't still rediscovered it. But if you notice the position of Uttarakhand on, and try to imagine it on the world map, it's one of those places which sits so nicely at the intersection of, species that have their ranges in the Palearctic region, in the Indo-Malayan region, and, also in peninsular India. So it's a very interesting mix of diversities coming together. And of course, nobody, because the last surveys were done in 1870s prior to when bat detectors were in use, we don't know anything about the echolocation calls. And another thing that you should know about me is I'm also a bird watcher. So all my decisions about field sites depend on where I'm going to see new species of birds. And that's what I did in Uttarakhand as well. This is what my life list in India looked like after Uttarakhand. Prior to this, it was somewhere in the 600. So, Uttarakhand helped me gave me a good jump in my bird life list as well. And honestly, the landscape also has seen a drastic amount of change. So this is a photo taken roughly at the same angle, a good 125 years apart. And Mussoorie, this is the town where this was taken, was used to be a British summer capital and has now become, a sprawling city up in the mountains. So these land use changes, and the Peter Stuyvesant bat was discovered, further east of this particular area, like just a few kilometers east of this area. So, this also makes it important to resurvey a landscape like this. But of course, when you're going to a new place, you don't want to get completely onto the job. You start it easy, and that's what we did. This is this building is the Forest Research Institute, a very fine architectural example combining, both European and Indian elements. We just went there for a day of sightseeing. It also happens to be a place which, a lot of Indians would recognize even if they haven't seen, because it features in a lot of Bollywood movies. A lot of songs, a lot of movies are shot, in this campus. And it was here that we came across a bat that nobody had seen in the Western Himalayas before that. So that was the state of bat inventory that we were dealing with back in 2016. That even the most common bats in the commonest of places, most frequently visited places, were not known. And since then, we've got specimens of these bats, and we're reworking the taxonomy. So it's no longer the European free-tailed bat. But I won't. I wish I could tell you more about my stories. Just wandering around Uttarakhand, catching bats with my lovely field crew. But I will go on to I'll keep jumping from from one phase of this project to another. So the most important phase when I was doing my survey in Uttarakhand was the a survey of this particular place called Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, because this ended up being a field site where I invested for the next 4 or 5 years. So this place, what's special about this place is that you have a neat elevational gradient all the way from 1500 meters to 3500 meters, all pretty contiguous to contiguous in that in a single mountain range. And from the lower elevation where you are in dense oak forest, it's hardly a few kilometers uphill, and then you are in alpine meadows which are completely treeless, and that still do exist here. So this particular area was one of my most favored sites, and it's also a wildlife sanctuary, so a little less human disturbance than you would get in other places. And the diversity is great. They're not, maybe somebody from the neotropics would probably laugh at it, but to have 32 species in an area like this for the old world, especially India, which was an island for a very long time in geological history, is pretty interesting. And some of the fascinating bats here are the Kashmir cave bat, a species endemic to Western Himalayas, from whatever we know so far, and heavily dependent on streams because it's a trawling species. And streams all over the Himalayas are getting dammed at a very rapid rate. So, this could potentially become an important model organism for conservation oriented research. And in the same elevation, in the lower elevations, you have four different species of horseshoe bats of varying shapes and sizes. Starting from the smallest Blythe's horseshoe bat to the largest woolly horseshoe bat. Everything occurs within a few square kilometers. Another special bat of this area is the Joffer's pipistrelle, one of my favorite bats actually, because until now it was thought to be very rare. And uh, after re-examining museum specimens, people thought that it occurs in the northeastern part of the country and in Southeast Asia. But every year we've caught multiple individuals, breeding individuals. In fact, when we were sampling post-COVID, one of my field assistants joked that, that if not humans, at least this particular bat has had a baby boom. We got so many pregnant females during that time. And as you go to the higher elevations, the diversity changes. You have plecotus coming, showing up in your nets, beautiful long-eared bats, and also also a very rare species of fruit bat called the Blandford's fruit bat, which I've only caught twice in 5 years. And once the first time I caught it was in a very mixed maple, oak, pine kind of a forest, something that is rather hard to find in that area. And the rarest of them all definitely was this one called the somber bat, which was until 1972 only known from the eastern part of the Himalayas, and described in 1970s. And the only other record is this particular photo that you see in front of you from 2017, and that was unfortunately the only time I ever caught it in 5 years of working in that area. So all of this information now you can find it in my paper, where my first time actually writing a very descriptive monograph, and I thoroughly liked the experience of writing a very taxonomic paper, where we describe 35 species from 5 families, which include 9 records for Western Himalayas, one record that is new to India, and we describe the echolocation calls of all of these bats, and along with my very nice co-authors. And so this paper, this was one of the, so you can go find this paper. And what this paper also led to is something that I try to maintain. It's on my blog. If you Google this, you should probably get the link to. It should lead you to my blog, where I archive all my recordings. And and at the moment I have recordings of 64 species of Indian bats. So somewhere close to the 50% mark. of our diversity. And so this allows me to, add some notes about how to identify different species in different parts of the country. And none of this would have been possible without catching so many, different species in Uttarakhand. So now I'm jumping to the next phase. This was Natural history is all well and good, and especially for bats, it's absolutely what we need. But natural history and taxonomy are the starting point and not the end point. They give you the baseline data from which you launch yourself into other questions. And the question that I launched myself to happened during my PhD in the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research. And many of you might recognize the face to my right in the photo, which is Christian Vogt, my PhD supervisor, a big name in uh, research, especially on wind energy and light pollution and almost every topic about bats, and Victoria Ratchuk, who's a quantitative ecologist and served as my and a community ecologist who served as my co-supervisor. So with Victoria, Christian, and some very nice collaborators from India, we went on to understand, the community, the diversity of these bats a little better, using so during fieldwork, we had not just seen species, identified them, but we had also collected data on their morphology, and now was the time to put it into good use. So the first question that I asked during my PhD was, how does elevation, or how does how do taxonomic functional and phylogenetic diversity change with elevation in in a Himalayan bat community? And for those of you who are not very familiar with functional diversity, it's to put it crudely, it's the diversity of shapes and sizes, the diversity of forms of species in a community that allow them to perform different functions in the ecosystem. So a very simple example would be if you look at the birds, swift and a swallow. Swift with long pointed wings takes longer glides of the sky. Swallows with short and broad wings, are more maneuverable. So theoretically, they might hunt insects in a different manner, and then you can sort of backtrack that with that information to the bat world as well. So theory in community ecology, community assembly theory, predicts that harsher conditions filter traits that are required for survival. So if you assume this to be, each of these dots to be a species represented by a given set of traits, the closer they are means that they are similar to each other. And if you imagine this to be a phylogeny, so you will expect harsh conditions to filter the community in such a way that they are similar in traits, so that because they're probably using those traits to survive these harsh conditions. Of course, I'm making it extremely simplistic now for want of time, but feel free to ask questions. And those species may also be phylogenetically similar because maybe the phylogeny is what is imparting these traits to them. And this is a phenomenon called environmental filtering. And because we're talking about harsh conditions, we expect such a situation to happen in the higher elevations. Whereas if you have benign environmental conditions, uh, resources are abundant, species can either specialize on certain resources, or there is intense competition which may have wiped certain similar species out, you expect to see dispersion both in traits and maybe also in phylogeny, because species that evolved together may have outcompeted, one may have outcompeted the other. So in such a situation, what you expect is a phenomenon called limiting similarity, which I had predicted would occur in the lower elevations. Now, what our data suggested is that species richness, very expectedly, so the scale is, even though it says species richness, is actually sonotype richness because we had to combine acoustics and morpho and captures here. The lowest elevation, of course, has the highest species richness, and as you grow high, as you go up the mountain, species richness declines, and leading to a very depopulated community of five different species in the higher elevation. And now that was about, the species and their identities. How do these species, how do their trait diversities and their phylogenetic diversities change in this elevational gradient? Bats at the highest elevation, as we expected, had very homogeneous traits. The communities were so similar functionally that, it basically pointed to an abiotic filtering mechanism probably being in play. But interestingly, there was not much change. There was no significant change in phylogenetic diversity. So, which means that the species that are similar to each other are, or rather, phylogenetically, all of these communities are rather similar. So, the species that are present in the lower elevations and that are not present in the higher elevations are species that are very similar to each other. And that those turned out to be the horseshoe bats, which I'm not presenting here because four different, like I said, four different species of horseshoe bats, all belonging to the same genus. You don't have them in the high elevation, so it leads to a massive clustering of traits and, without causing any change in phylogeny. Feel free to ask this later if it's too complicated now. I'll try to have another go at it. And or better still, you can find this on my in my paper, which is the first chapter of my thesis. Now jumping to the second chapter, where my personal motivation was to add a numerical element to the natural history of bats that we are studying because, well, we don't really know much about the natural history of Indian bats and more so Himalayan species. So I put it under the umbrella of, studying niche partitioning in bat communities. And to do this, we used stable isotopes and it's slightly technical to get into the details, but briefly, what you are looking at are stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes. The nitrogen isotope value, so this scale, the higher the value, it means that the bat is foraging at a higher trophic level. We don't exactly know what it's feeding on, but we know that it's feeding on a higher trophic level. The carbon axis varies with the basal nutrition system. So if it's a C3 plant, it's a different carbon signature. A C4 plant is a big different carbon signature. An aquatic plant versus a terrestrial plant are two different carbon sources. So and of course, the wider these ellipses, the more generalist the diet of that species is. So what we find here is that, and because we are sampling bats at different elevations, we also had the opportunity to compare niche partitioning and how it varies across elevations. So what we find is that in the lower elevation, where there are so many more species, they, even if you would expect them to compete, they actually all sharing the same resource quite happily, and there's a massive overlap in the niches of species in the lower elevation. As you keep going higher, the number of species drops, which means that you would probably not expect a lot of competition, but the environmental conditions are harsh. And remember that these species are also, functionally quite similar to each other, yet they tend to feed on relatively different things in order to avoid overlap in a harsh environmental condition. And now coming to, well, that was more about the community ecology perspective, but what do I get to know about the species in this landscape? Um, my one of my well actually I keep seeing myself saying one of my favorite bats for every photo, but I truly miss these bats because I haven't seen them in the last 3 years. So the little tube nose bat is has a very wide diet, and it seems to feed a lot on aquatic insects at a lower trophic level. And a very tiny bat, hardly 4 grams in weight, and quite a rare bat as well. On the other hand, the Kashmir cave bat, remember the trawling species that I was talking about, you would expect it to have an aquatic diet, but it seems like even if it's feeding around water, it probably is feeding on, insects, non-aquatic insects based on the carbon isotopes, and it's feeding on slightly higher trophic levels based on the nitrogen isotope values. What exactly is it feeding on? We unfortunately can't tell. But the most interesting for me are the plecotos, the long-eared bats, which are seem to be, very specialist in comparison to all other, species in this area. They are not only are they feeding on something specific, they also inhabit areas above 2000 or 2500 meters. So, so theoretically speaking, climate change, this might be a species that, based on theory, is more expected to be threatened than the other ones. And again, this is a paper that you can find published last year, and you can read more about it. The paper contains more of community ecology than I've put into these two slides. Now, moving on to the last phase. Now, this is the phase where I want to talk about my current work. This is um, just going to be a teaser to my current work. Now, unfortunately, or rather, well, I brought it upon myself. I took it upon myself to move away from the Himalayas and focus on as many parts of the country as possible. I still do miss my Himalayan bats, and I need to find a way to get back. But now I'm talking about what's happening beyond the Himalayas. And in my current position as the India project manager for for the bat project in Nature Conservation Foundation and in Bat Conservation International, I've been fortunate to gather a pretty good team of people who are all working on different projects. Some who are two of them are directly employed by our project. Everybody else I'm co-supervising with a whole bunch of people, and I'm also, of course, working together with some very bright-minded conservationists like Kulu, who works on snow leopards, Isabella, whom many of you would know, and you can find a recording of a great talk on the Comoros, on the Livingstone's flying fox from Comoros in the webinar series as well. So the first thing that we are trying to do is, well, actually, this is somewhat a repetition of the introduction as well. We're trying to prepare a conservation plan for Indian bats, and Priya and Maz are taking the lead on this, where we are reuniting bat researchers in India. India has always been has for the last 22 years, Indian bat community has been, has worked in isolation, and now we are trying to bring everybody together. The younger generation is, becoming very excited about collaborating, and we're happy to bring them together to chart a roadmap for research and conservation for the next 5 to 10 years for Indian bats. And that is something we've just kicked off, and it will I hope to have some, more information to tell you maybe by the end of this year. And Caroline and Kezia are two very bright students who independently came up with the idea, and which I also had in my mind. And thankfully, they both came to me for co-supervision. And they are studying the effects of urbanization on insectivorous bats in Bangalore. Bangalore is a sprawling metropolis of 8 to 10 million people. Densely populated in certain areas, in some areas slightly less dense. And they've just finished their field work, so I'm very curious to see what comes out of their study. Srijit, again, who's a master's student from Aligarh Muslim University. I'm supervising his project on, the effects of wind energy on bats in Western Himalayas. So in a sense, I'm actually, even though I did something completely different for my PhD, I've now started following in my PhD supervisor's footsteps. And I'm working on the same themes that I saw him working on during my PhD. And again, Srijit had just finished his fieldwork, so and preliminary results are just coming in. And to the best of our knowledge, this is probably the first scientific study on wind energy, on the effects of wind energy on bats in India. Then Arjun is adding more information to the natural history of the Salim Ali Strood bat. This is an endangered species endemic to the southern part of the Western Ghats, occurs only in relatively higher elevations. And this is a collaboration with NCBS and a bunch of researchers from Kerala in the south of India. And once this project kicks off, it will be I mean, this is a bat that I haven't seen. So first, I really want to see this bat, and then I want to see what, Arjun adds to the knowledge of this bat as well. So with that, and then the last project that I haven't put in, but because we haven't yet found a lead to start it, is about archaeological sites and how bats living in monuments which are protected for their cultural heritage. How can we figure out a mechanism where cultural heritage, the protection of cultural heritage, also protects bats living in these monuments, and and understand this conflict situation a bit better and try to come up with win-win solutions for archaeological site managers and bats. So with that, I think I'm leaving plenty of time for questions now. So yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Rohit. That was absolutely fantastic and just incredible to see the amount of work that you're doing. I actually just was wondering, as a you'd mentioned about putting all your recordings onto Zeno Canto, and I just actually wondered if you wanted to maybe explain a little bit more to people about that, because that's quite an exciting platform as well.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for that question, Rachel. It's something that has very recently come up, in fact, and I didn't know about it until a few weeks or months ago. So Xenocanto, which is an excellent database for bird calls, I mean, started as a great bird call library, has maybe whatever 7,000 plus species, species of birds covered in their library, has now opened up to bats, and that's great news for all bat researchers because we can now have a central platform where we can all dump our bat recordings. But the only thing that I want to figure out, and if anybody from the audience knows this, I'd be happy to hear that. What kind of calls do they accept? I mean, is it only calls of species that have been held in the hand, identified, and then recorded so that we are 100% sure about the identity, but then most often these calls do not really mimic the on-field conditions, because the bat calls tend to be a lot flatter when they are flying in the open space rather than when they've been recorded by an observer standing 10-15 meters away. So these are things that I need to figure out before I start putting my recordings up, because I would ideally like to have recordings which capture a whole lot of diversity of the same species, recorded in different scenarios so that most people can make the best use of those recordings. So I'm
Yeah,
happy to hear from people.
brilliant. Yes, if anybody would like to ask a question directly, please feel free to raise your hand, or you can pop your questions in the chat. And I guess that your oh, here we go. We do have sorry if my question is not related to the presentation, but what is the best way to start working with bats and get into academia, so master's, PhD, because I'm trying to get some experience before getting into a master's, and I'm feeling kind of stuck because of these experiences are unpaid, and I really want to get that approach. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and actually also nice to have some kind of a sparkling kind of early career professional here to give you that advice. So yeah.
Thanks for that question, Esteban. I completely feel you. I'm not I'm not old enough to be experienced, and hence not that experienced to answer this question, but I do relate to what you're saying because I was in a similar situation in 2016 when I was doing my bat survey in Uttarakhand. And I just come out of my masters, and I wanted an opportunity which allows me to just get a feel of bats, not be bound by a study design where you're collecting data in a very fixed manner. I just wanted to understand a bit more about their natural history, because before I became comfortable enough to ask you know deeper questions about bat biology. And during that time, I actually was in this phase where I thought academia is not for me, and I don't, I wanted to find ways to continue working on bats without being in academia. Unfortunately, from my experience, I'd be happy to hear, counter experiences. from my experience, that really didn't seem like, the most possible way out. And because everywhere there's a roadblock after another. I mean, somewhere for funders or for people who are going to hire you, degrees do become important. And unfortunately, a lot of people have the tendency of relating degrees to, your your ability to multitask or your ability to manage teams, etc. But unfortunately, that's how my experience has been. But on the flip side, doing a PhD was actually a great decision and was a great experience as well, because it just trains you to do research so much better, and it also trains you to manage teams. Sometimes helps you to manage teams better and raise funding. There are a lot of skills that, like, even though I'm not completely, I'm in a second semi-academic position. I do have students, I do guide students, but I'm not 100% expected to publish. So, so I'm in that position. I like this position because it allows me to do a lot of different things. But even this position would not have been possible without doing a PhD. So, so it's, yeah, you lose, you give some, you take some. It's that kind of a scenario. But I think 100% I would recommend doing a PhD, even if you don't want an academic career.
Thank you very much. So Bruce said, great talk. Is there evidence of elevation migrations, either kind of daily or seasonally, among the Himalayan bats?
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for the compliment. This is something we need to look at a little more deeply. We do believe that the free-tailed bats do migrate elevationally. There is anecdotal, evidence to suggest so, both from Nepal and from India. People have noticed that anecdotally, nothing done over a very long time, that there you do get calls of free-tailed bats during certain times, but not during other times at different elevations. So so it needs to be looked in with a little more carefully. It's definitely uh, a huge possibility, just that somebody needs to go out and measure. And actually, before going to the next question, I just want to backtrack to Esteban's question for a moment. I do want to tell you, Esteban, that you could also because I noticed you said that finding a mentor is hard. I do want to plug Global South Bats here, because Global South Bats is a new consortium. I mean, it's not relative, it's not new. It's been in existence for 4 years, but we are trying to to do a lot more mentorship programs for Global South researchers, and we're trying to create more opportunities. So do look Global South Bats up, and I'm sure you'll find a great mentor in your area. Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I've just popped the link quickly in the chat there for you. Yeah, that's fantastic. And Rohit was saying it's kind of connecting bat researchers, especially early career professionals in the global south. So that's great. And also GBATnet as well is a global one as well. But yeah, no, both of those that's really good advice, and definitely getting a mentor. So Mohammed has a question saying, please can you describe about the distance for elevation divisions in the Himalayan region during your study?
So these were my sites were roughly 500 meters apart from each other. So I had 1500 meters, 2000, 2500, and yeah, 3000 meters.
Brilliant. So I had a question that I think, certainly we've found this in Africa as well. It's really difficult with, we don't have all the call libraries and, kind of so identifying down to species level. So I was quite interested in, you've got an incredible amount of recordings. So I guess how have you found going about sort of getting your sort of baseline and some, I suppose a call library for you to share? And did you have any call library to draw on, or did you have to kind of pretty much start from scratch?
I had well, for the Himalayas we didn't have any call libraries, but so that part of the work pretty much happened from scratch. Catching every different species, making sure you're recording them in the correct manner. Sometimes you fail, sometimes you get the calls right. So that is how the Himalayas worked progress. For most other parts of the country, where I have not actively tracked myself, I and this is actually something that people in India, bat researchers in India, and maybe in other parts of the global south as well, we often make the mistake of not being bold enough to record bats, even freely flying bats, and try and identify those from, whatever is published. And because, then we often fall into the trap of this circularity that you need to have the bat in hand, only then will you get the positive ID. And then, this call recording will feed into the database, but it's feeding into the database, but it's a call recorded in a very specific scenario. It doesn't really reflect what the bat emits in a natural free flight. So wherever I go, I do try to record bats just flying, try to identify them, and of course use published call libraries to to make an estimate of how sure I am with my identification. So, one could always argue that I'm not 100% sure, but that's fine. But, at least what I'm adding to the database is more variety of, situations in which the bat was recorded. So I think people in our regions should generally, just do a lot more recordings of freely flying bats and use the same approach to try and, add more value to the call library. Of course, you have one gold standard of a release call, but then these free flying bat calls can also add a lot of value. Sorry, does that answer your question, Rachel?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's really great. And I think also, quite inspiring for others working in regions where there isn't a lot of that resource. No, that was great. So we've got another talk from Adrish saying, amazing talk, sharing your experience. As diverse as bats in India, how diverse are researchers in terms of kind of age, group, locality, etc.?
I really like that question. Thanks, Adrish. It's it's a very okay, so diverse in terms of age groups. We do have, I think there is um, a senior group which is everybody's sort of close to retirement. There is a relatively smaller, middle-aged, and by middle-aged, I mean, say, let's put them at 40 to 50, 40 to 60 years old. That group is at the moment rather small, and there's a whole bunch of researchers below 30. So, so it's or at least, the ones that you come to know of because, well, unfortunately, social media is the thing that connects all of us. So it's a little biased towards the younger audience, but I would still say that the younger audience is quite active, and which is another reason why doing a conservation plan at this time makes a lot of sense, because people are in this mood to collaborate, and they are very enthusiastic about collaborating. Locality wise, there's a huge South Indian bias, and this is true for most fields of ecology. Southern Indians are generally, are the research infrastructure is a lot better here, and people are, have a stronger culture of participating in ecology and related fields. Unfortunately, the parts of diversity that really affect me or that make me sad are female participation. Women participation, unfortunately, in India, when I go to BAT conferences abroad, there are, women leading in so many different countries, not just in the global north, but also in the global south. But India really stands out as an exception, and I would genuinely want to, try and understand the reasons behind it so that we can try and improve female participation. Um, the other is, of course, India is big on the caste system, and if for those of you who don't know, there's an inherent social hierarchy, and there are people from the lower caste who've been historically oppressed, and those people feature very rarely in sciences in general, and in bat research very hard to find people from from lower castes, and I think that's another part of the diversity that needs to be improved.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I think that's certainly the same for us across Africa. There's, we're definitely working a lot harder on diversity and struggle with women in science, and definitely trying to attract more young professionals who, sometimes struggle to get their springboard their careers. So Miraza has a question saying, during my stay in Bhopal, I think I observed that there were banyan trees tree in a road divider on which hundreds of fruit bats used to roost during the summer. When the temperatures increased during June and July, they fell on the road and getting killed by automobiles. Could there possibly be a solution for this?
Unfortunately not. I think, flying foxes are, which is most likely the bat in the question. Flying foxes are extremely prone to heat waves, and every time the temperature goes above 40, and Bhopal is in central India, which is where I was born and brought up, and our summer temperatures are 43, 44 on an average. So it's terrible for flying foxes. And I think, I'm not 100% sure, and flying fox, researchers can correct me. Maybe maybe their thermal ranges evolved in such a way because they don't really have many natural predators. So, so probably heat was something that traditionally controlled over the course of evolution, sort of controlled their populations. But of course, with more severe and more intense heat waves and average global temperatures just going higher and higher every year, this may get disastrous for flying foxes. And I can't think of a solution to that, except maybe otherwise planning our cities in such a way that they have um, green cover to rely on for roosting. But at the same time, to do that, we need to know what exactly drives flying fox roost selection. And that is something that's very, very poorly understood in India. Maybe there are studies to borrow from Australia, but in India, it's extremely poorly known. And actually, the trees that you pointed out, banyan, has wherever I've gone, I've often seen flying fox roosts on banyan trees. It's a sacred tree in India, and maybe that is probably the reason why flying foxes choose that tree, even if it's right in the middle of a city. They know that they've probably learned from experience of so many years that this tree is not being harmed by people, so they just go and roost there. But we never know. We don't know what is driving their roost selection to come up with sound, mitigation measures.
Yeah, it's certainly, yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. In Australia, have had quite a lot of issues. And I know we certainly had some questions raised from Central Africa as well about, kind of mass mortality. So we've just got, Lorraine has said, a very interesting talk. Is there data on bats related to the archaeological sites? Good question.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for the compliment. The question is great. We don't have, we do know a lot about what bats occur in archaeological sites in India, especially. It's just that this data is in people's photographs. It's not out, widely available in scientific literature. And that's another thing that, we want to bring out of the archaeological sites work that we are planning to do. So, and again, very interesting questions. It's a great study system, both to understand how bats select archaeological sites, what similar to flying foxes choosing certain roosting trees, what drives different species of bats to choose different archaeological sites, what are the kind of structures that they are selecting, and of course what the kind of conflict that it leads to is these people do not, I mean, people who manage monuments do not want bats to be there, and but they are great. The bats have been roosting there for a long time. So how do we then? So these data are going to, I mean, any kind of data is basically going to help us, find solutions for both bats to be there while archaeological sites and monuments to stay preserved. That makes sense.
Brilliant. And I suppose similar to kind of along those lines, I was just interested in some of your work in caves. I mean, have you found much kind of sort of human wildlife conflict or human bat conflict there? And I certainly there was a site that I was doing some work in Botswana, and they were really concerned that the bats were damaging the stalagmites and stalactites. So there was concern that they were actually trying to kind of will kill the bats in the cave. So I'm just wondering if you've had any similar issues with cave systems.
So I have actually not had a lot of experience working in caves in India. My only proper cave experience, like actually doing research, was in the Andaman Islands, which was a decade ago now. But I recently went to the northeast of India to do a recce of a beautiful karst ecosystem, lots and lots of caves. Which are regularly surveyed by professional caving groups, and I tagged along with them. From my um, high level understanding of that place, it seems like these caves are there's not a huge show cave market in India. So, show caves, even if they exist, they have not completely, in many places, they have not completely been brought under the purview of, the Archaeological Survey of India, which manages these sites. So, or the Geological Survey of India. So tourism in show caves is not yet a very big thing in India. So that's again, that then it automatically doesn't lead to a lot of conflict in that area. But there are a few show caves, and I suspect that I don't know if bats were driven out because they were damaging stalactites and stalagmites, or maybe, just the natural process of so many tourists coming in and coming out has disturbed them to leave those caves. So, yeah, I mean, worth exploring, just that I haven't studied yet.
I mean, to be fair, most of the cave systems we have in Southern Africa, actually, the bats are very much left alone, which is great. So it's quite an unusual one. But thank you very, very much for a really interesting talk. Very excited to hear more about your conservation plan as well coming out. I'm sure that's going to be very exciting to hear. And also, kind of spotlighting all the students' work, certainly kind of urbanisation and wind energy and all these really important kind of topics that have been coming up. Cecilia
Thank you,
just said an
Ricky.
amazing talk, Rohit, really fascinating PhD work. And I love the honesty in your stories about your motivations and the curiosity that drove it all. And I think that is totally true. And I'm pretty sure there'll be lots of people wanting to come to India and be, help you out. But certainly hope to make it there myself. It's an absolutely fascinating and fantastic
Thank you so much,
country
Ricky.
with incredible diversity. So thank you very much for your time and giving us a talk today. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure. And for people looking for mentors, actually, I do want to plug Cecilia's name. Great mentor out there. Great role model for all of you out there. Thank you so much.
Thanks then. Take care, everybody. Bye.